Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we are continuing our series, a short series of goddesses in every woman and gods in every man. We are on a second podcast talking about the gods in every man. This comes from a book of the same name by Jean Shinoda Bolen, and we've been talking for the last several episodes about the different archetypes that show up as feminine and masculine energies in people's lives. Often, in women's lives, the feminine archetypes show up, and in men's lives, the masculine archetypes show up. And today we're going to continue talking. If you remember from last podcast, we talked about the three father god energies of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. And in this episode, we're going to start in on the sun god archetypes, sun, S-O-N god archetypes. And we're going to talk about two of them in this episode here. But before we do, let's give a quick framework for the sun god archetypes. Basically, there's three broad brush categories of the sun gods. And all the sun gods are sons of Zeus from last episode. So, we talked about Zeus in the last episode, And you could categorize the sun gods into three broad categories of favorite sons, rejected sons, and the ambivalently viewed sun. And there's one of them. So favorite sons are Apollo and Hermes. We're going to talk about those two archetypes today. The rejected sons are Ares and Hephaestus, and the ambivalently viewed sun is Dionysus.
So the characteristics of the favored sons are very much like Zeus. And the reason why is because all of these sun gods, S-O-N, are from Zeus in one way or another. So Apollo and Hermes were both direct children of Zeus, and so was Ares. But Hephaestus was actually Hera's son, almost like a virgin birth. She gave birth to him what is called parthenogenically, or genetically rather, which is effectively, we mostly only see it in flowers and some lizards, but it's basically a virgin birth. But Hera was Zeus's wife, and so when she had this child through virgin birth, Zeus basically became his father in name. And then with Dionysus, what's interesting is that Zeus was both quote-unquote mother and father to Dionysus, because Dionysus is actually born of Zeus's body, almost in a very similar way that Athena was. Athena came from his head, from a splitting headache when he tried to eat up the sun that was destined to take him over, and then it actually ended up being Athena. And then Dionysus was sewn into his leg, into Zeus's thigh while he was gestating, and so Zeus basically gave birth to him through his thigh. So Zeus, in a weird way with Dionysus, is both father and mother. So regardless of exactly the etymology tale, all of these sons are from, in some way, sons of Zeus. The two favored sons of Apollo and Hermes, like Joel mentioned, we'll cover these two favored sons in today's podcast, are favored because they are like Zeus in many ways. They're emotionally distant, they're mentally active, they're more in the realm of the mind. And they look like Zeus in a lot of ways, but they also looked to Zeus to settle disputes and to make sure that they were gaining his approval. And that's what's kind of the energetic difference, I think, between the father gods that we talked about in the last podcast and the sun gods, is it seems like the father gods look to themselves for approval. Like they're very what's the word?
Referential?
Yeah, that's perfect. Self-referential. Whereas the sun gods look to others for their approval and to make sure that they're doing the right thing. Even when they're, say, rejected gods like Ares and Hephaestus, their stories, or sort of their archetypal energy, comes from the fact that they were rejected. So they're still in reaction to the relationship to Zeus, or the father god, and that's what sort of defines their energy. And the rejected gods of Ares and Hephaestus, which we'll talk about in the next episode, they're rejected because they aren't like Zeus. They're more emotionally driven, they're action-oriented. And so they end up not looking to Zeus as much, because when they look to Zeus and they can't look like him, and when they look to him, then they get rejected. And then the final god is, as you mentioned, sort of ambivalently viewed, and this is Dionysus. And Dionysus has a completely different story. In fact, Dionysus has a story that almost is alchemical, kind of like Aphrodite was. Like Aphrodite was the alchemical goddess, and she was the exception to these rules. And Dionysus kind of plays a very similar role in that he is ambivalently viewed because some people really love him and others reject him. And because of that, he has a very, sort of an interesting place in the pantheon, either because of his relationship to Zeus and this ambivalently viewed position, or maybe kind of unrelated, he changes the feel of Olympus. He's the final god to be, entered into the pantheon, and actually he replaced Hestia, and that was kind of something we talked about in the episode about Hestia and the virgin goddesses, is that she didn't really put up a fuss, and that was kind of archetypal of Hestia. And it's also archetypal of Dionysus to dethrone somebody and take their place. And so some of these etymology stories around his relationship to the pantheon and his introduction into Olympus and how he's viewed and sort of the kind of god he is very much, it's very much leads to how he changes the flavor of the entire pantheon. He's something new, and kind of like Aphrodite was something new amongst the goddesses, Dionysus is something new among the gods. And so we'll address him in the final episode.
Yeah, so we'll talk about Ares, Hephaestus, and Dionysus soon. But today, let's talk about Apollo and Hermes. Let's talk about Apollo first. Apollo was the god of the sun, S-U-N. This time it's spelled S-U-N. A god of the sun. He was an archer, a lawgiver. Obviously, he's one of the favorite sons. He probably was the favorite son, actually, of Zeus, even over Hermes. In the favorite category, he was top dog as far as favorite sun gods. He was god of the arts, and he had precepts that he followed, these kind of ethos precepts that he followed, which were know thyself and nothing in excess. So very clear-headed, very much a down-to-earth, rational thinking energy as far as an archetype. Apollo was the son of Zeus and Leto. He was the second-born twin brother of Artemis. If you remember from the Goddesses in Every Woman podcast, when we talked about Artemis, she was goddess of the hunt or the moon. She was an archer. She would go out into the forest with her bow and arrow. And in fact, Apollo also was an archer. But here's what's interesting about the etymology of their relationship when it started. Artemis actually was born first to Leto. And Apollo was actually inside of Leto. Leto was laboring for 9 days before Apollo came out, to the point where Artemis helped birth her own brother. She actually helped bring her brother into the world. So there's two women now laboring to bring Apollo into existence, his mother and his sister attempting to bring him out into the world, and it took 9 days, according to the genealogy, the mythos of how he started. He was basically this golden-haired boy that just showed up, almost with some, you can see from his etymology tale, it's almost a sense of entitlement. Others suffered and worked to bring him forth in the world, and now he shows up. Hey, I'm here I am. Thanks for rolling out the red carpet for me. Energy that he brings when he shows up to the world when he's first born.
Yeah, and Apollo and Artemis share a lot of characteristics. They both were honored for their purity. She was one of the virgin goddesses. He never married or had a consort, so in some weird ways he's kind of like a virgin god himself. And they were known for their remoteness and the fact that they did disappearing acts. Artemis would go disappear into the forest, and Apollo would disappear into the mysterious realm of the Hyperboreans. So they both did sort of disappearing acts for a while. They were very heady, very rational, extremely competitive, particularly competitive with each other. And in fact, their competitiveness led to Artemis killing the only man she ever loved, because Apollo sort of coaxed her into killing Orion from a distance. And so they have really sort of very similar stories, except that Artemis is more of sort of like an independent creature. She goes off and alone with her nymphs and kind of shows up whenever she thinks it's important to show up. Whereas Apollo is more of a celebrated god in society. He has more of a presence in society, and he has a little bit more of his fingers in many pies of, like politics and prophecy. And he showed up every day as the god of the sun, right? The sun would rise because Apollo would bring his chariot around to have the sun rise. So Apollo was a very beloved god amongst the Greeks, whereas Artemis, while beloved, was a little bit more distant and remote. And that's interesting, like you mentioned. Artemis helped her mother with her labor because, as the son and daughter of Zeus, and Leto being pregnant and giving birth to these two children, that of course pissed Hera off, who was perpetually jealous, and so Hera would not allow the goddess of childbirth to help with this childbirth of Leto's, and so they had to do it all on their own. And so Artemis was with her mother when she was giving birth to Apollo. And as you mentioned, it's almost like Apollo benefited from the labor of these people and just sort of showed up. And it kind of gives, even though Artemis and Apollo have very similar tracks and similar personalities and they have that competitiveness, you can see how that may have colored the story or the archetype of Artemis to be more protective, whereas with Apollo, it's more the recipient of a lot of benefits.
Yeah, and so Apollo's ethos, much like Artemis, Apollo also watched over youth on the cusp of maturity. Artemis is known for the goddess of young girls, and you could argue that Apollo was the god of young men, making sure that they were safe in that transition point from childhood to adulthood. And when another aspect of Apollo, when he felt like justice or punishment was needing to be doled out, it was swift and severe and very intense, much like Artemis. It was like almost vindictive and punitive in a lot of ways. As far as the ethos of Apollo showing up also, it's more about seeing the details of life from an overall perspective, is how Apollo's energy typically shows up. So it's the ability to see the trees in the forest, but also being able to zoom out and see the forest as a collection of trees, right? And getting a perspective on what those individual details or those trees mean in the forest. Also, Apollo's this energy tends to be very focused on success, on creating order, on building skill, on being very much organized, disciplined, having a sense of accomplishment, success, and forward thinking and forward movement. Strategy, not very much on the ups and downs of emotion, but just pragmatic and forward thinking. A very logical mind. In fact, this is one of the reasons I think Zeus had him as his favorite son. We've talked about this, is because of that logical, thinking, cerebral mind that Zeus just loved, right? He also, though, Apollo did have a little bit of an ethos of artistic nature to him, but it wasn't a very free-form, chaotic artistic nature. This isn't going to be like abstract painting or something. It's going to be very thoughtful, well-crafted, organized, disciplined creativity. So almost like if you could think of mathematics as an art form, you could think of Apollo. Very clear, pure. It's very higher ethic, if that's a word, higher ethic. It has a high ethic to it, I guess, the art that Apollo created. It was very important for him to have that artistic bent, but clean lines, clear logic behind the art he created.
Yeah, Bolin actually talks about Yo-Yo Ma being an example of an Apollo artist, like the precision that Yo-Yo Ma brings and the fact that he's almost perfect in what he does would be sort of that Apollo artistic ethic.
So when we talk about the Apollo energy being embodied by a man, so this is more in a concrete term, this energy showing up in a man's life, the Apollo man is rewarded by society. I mean, who doesn't want a thoughtful man who can create around in your life, in your circles, in your tribe, in your associates, create clear goals, set them, achieve them, create order, stability, forward thinking, not like irrational, erratic behavior, but steadiness. This is a really well-rewarded trait, especially in the Western societies that we're a part of here. In the United States, Western Europe, other places that are Western societies honor the Apollo man because he can get things done. He's focused on success, has his head straight ahead, getting the job done, and making things very practical. And in fact, as a child, Apollo wasn't very much into imaginative play. He was very logical and practical and wanted to know the real thing, the real nature of things, how they actually worked. Didn't sit around daydreaming all day, but got into action and really had the desire to please his father Zeus, to do the practical, pragmatic thing that would look good in the eyes of his father Zeus and make Zeus very proud of him. That's almost the driving nature of an Apollo man, looking for that approval from a father type figure is something that can often be a marker of the Apollo man. Unfortunately, with this can also come struggle. Remember, Apollo got brought into the world by his mother and his sister, didn't really have to do a lot of work himself, metaphorically speaking. And because he's so driven to success and logic and the world rewards him, there's a temptation and there's this ability for an Apollo man to get narcissistic if he's not careful. Because things can come so easy to him, because he can set goals and achieve them, and people often work to reward and support the Apollo man, he can all of a sudden start drinking his own Kool-Aid and say, you know what, I might be the best ever at XYZ, and can get narcissistic, a little self-focused for his own good. And also, coming along with that can be cruel and punitive in punishment, especially with his words, can be biting and sharp, struggles with arrogance, very idealistic as well. So idealism can also be something that can get there and be a pain point for him. Of course, we just talked about some of the challenges Apollo has. It's not all bad. He's got some good characteristics as well. And if you're a man that this energy shows up for, obviously these are things you need to watch out for, and they may or may not be like super prevalent in your life, depending on how much work you've done, how much personal growth you've done. So those are just some overarching concepts of how Apollo might show up in an actual man.
Yeah, because I don't think all Apollos are necessarily raised in a context that rewards them. Like most will. The characteristics of Apollo, he's got this, Bolin talks about him, he's, the god of the sun. He's got a sunny disposition. Usually he's a pretty bright, he's like a bright person, not just intellectually, but he's like bright, just has a bright disposition. And that friendliness, I think, it works in his favor. And so there's a lot of context where he usually excels and does well, but not every Apollo is going to necessarily have a red carpet rolled out for them. That just that's a tendency that things come easier to them and they don't recognize the work that others have done that have facilitated how easy things are for them. Like, it wasn't Apollo's fault that he was, his mom spent 9 days and 9 nights in labor. Like, that wasn't his fault. And it's not his fault that he didn't have to struggle for that somebody else did it in his behalf and that he benefited from that. So it's not like he's at fault for that. It's just sometimes Apollos, when they do have a lot of benefits coming their way, they might not reflect on what cost, to what cost in the world around them and that others have poured into it. By the same token, that lack of self-consciousness around that also works to his favor in building systems. For example, he was also the god of prophecy, even though he wasn't a prophet himself. He was just able to create a system of prophecy. And so it's almost like being able to leverage other people's gifts allows him to create a system that benefits everybody. And that's something that I think that we have a tendency to, denigrate this idea of like, well, you're just benefiting off the backs of others. But there are certain archetypes that are good at building systems that leverage other people's talents. And so they might not be the person who directly has the talent themselves, but they're good at creating a system where other people's talents can be of value. Because those of us who have talents might not know how to plug ourselves into a system that, creates a benefit to all. And so an Apollo archetype might be good at creating those structures. And so it appears as if they're benefiting from it, but really what they're doing is they're bringing their talent. They're bringing their talent of being able to gather all these people. And so I think that concept that him taking over sort of the Oracle of Delphi and creating all of those oracles and all those prophetic mediums and all of that under his control, he wasn't the person who necessarily was the prophet, but he was the person that made prophecy available to others.
It's almost kind of if you want to put it into business terms, kind of that CEO style where they're organizing, maybe the entrepreneur that's organizing the goals and objectives of a group of people to accomplish a goal. So it's not just a matter of accomplishing his own goals, but he has the ability to go and spot resource, talent, different, energies at play and weave them together to accomplish something bigger than just himself, which I think is it's a positive trait of Apollo, being able to do that. I think we need to be very clear. I think that's a really good trait that energy brings into a man's life, that to be able to take something and move all these energies together and coordinate them almost like a conductor of people
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's not like we don't reward that in society. Obviously, C-level executives get quite rewarded. And we also have a tendency, I think, in the modern world, when we want everything to be sort of democratized, we also have a tendency to denigrate it at the same time. Like we're starting to feel very ambivalent about that talent because it can feel exploitative. So an Apollo archetyped man, I think one of the ways to maintain a sense of balance is to recognize that that legitimately is a talent. That legitimately is something that they bring to the world, that ability to orchestrate resource and to make bigger things happen. And at the same time, having a sense of modesty and recognizing that the people that are working for them are also bringing talents that the Apollo archetype man is benefiting from. So it's a mutually beneficial arrangement. It's symbiotic. It's not just one person who's in the know and everybody else is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? Like it's working for everyone to create these systems.
I think of Evan Spiegel, the CEO, the creator and CEO, well, sort of creator and CEO of Snapchat and Snap Incorporated, who is very young. At the time of this recording, he's like 26, 27. He's one of the youngest. I think he's a billionaire, right? I think he's very, very wealthy. And he kind of had a life of success from the beginning. He was born into a upper middle class family. And he went to a really good school, a really good education, came out of that, and basically started Snapchat with a few other people. And it's just been one success after another. I'm sure he's had to struggle and work hard. I'm sure he has. But in some ways, you could look at him and go, man, he's had everything given to him. It's been a life of ease. He hasn't had to work really hard. And it almost seems like everything he touches turns to gold. And I think he's got a lot of this Apollo energy behind him, where he sets goals, he accomplishes them. And for a while, he was the darling of Wall Street, Silicon Valley. And now they're kind of like, wait a second here. Like, you don't really work for all of this. You kind of set this system up, and he takes a lot out of the system. And I think he's starting to now become aware of just how fortunate and lucky, quite frankly, he got to get to the place he's at, because I see some of the ways he's changed his perspective on things. But he had some struggle early on with things just falling in place for him as that Apollo-natured character.
Yeah, well, and also he just wanted to be control of everything. He wanted to do it all his own way, and that didn't necessarily work out for him all the time.
Wall Street's pushing back on that really hard.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges that Apollo archetyped men and those women who have Apollo as their animus, or the masculine side of a woman. I think one of the challenges they experience is that when things all of a sudden aren't easy, it's almost like that red carpet that they expect got kind of ripped out from underneath them. And there are areas that Apollos actually have legit challenges just in general, even if they've been a darling, even if everything has come easy to them. And again, that's not always the case. Apollo archetyped men and women who have him as an animus, they might have legitimately had to struggle. Like, they might not have a Zeus father that patted them on the head all the time and gave him approval. They might have had a situation where it was tough, and maybe they come from an abusive past, or they don't have a masculine energy there to give them the approval they desperately want. And so there are Apollos out there that have had to struggle, and I think they're weirdly enough, they're kind of the fortunate ones, because they're Apollos that don't take things for granted and they have more seasoning to them. But every Apollo on some level struggles with relationships. I think I actually misspoke when I said it's almost like he's like a virgin god. He wasn't. He had relationships. Artemis didn't have relationships, so that's why she was considered a virgin goddess. But even though he was rewarded for a sense of purity, he actually did have relationships, and he really struggled. He struggled with, he never was married or had a consort, but he did have women and men he was in love with, and they didn't always turn out well. Because the concept of the Cassandra complex, which some people might be familiar with, which is this idea of being able to see things coming and trying to communicate it to people and nobody listens to you. That's called the Cassandra complex. Well, that comes from the Greek character of Cassandra, who Apollo taught the gift of prophecy in exchange for her becoming his lover. And then after she learned the gift of prophecy, she reneged. She said, no, I'm not going to become your lover. And he got mad and he said, okay, well, I can't take away prophecy from you now, but I am going to curse you and say nobody will ever listen to you. So she knew the Trojan War was coming. and she had a bunch of prophecies to tell people about the Trojan War that could have actually probably prevented the war, honestly. But nobody would listen to her because she had been cursed. And Apollo was willing to do that because of his sort of what is the word? His what are those relationships where you make them very transactional? Because of his willingness to have a transactional relationship in order to gain love, and then that fell apart for him, then it ended up causing a lot of misery. And I think that's the challenge with Apollos, is Apollos tend to see things in terms of transactions. And so relationships can be a challenge for an Apollo. This is sort of that archetypal guy who like rolls up in, a sports car and expects to have, women fall in love with him based on what he has and possesses. And those are not relationships that are oftentimes very sustainable. Now, sometimes they can be. And if an Apollo ends up with, say, a Hera who will be, who is willing to enter that transactional relationship and also see it through to its end, then it works out okay. But if she's a Persephone and this is just a momentary thing for her, then an Apollo can get really hurt and not understand why he's having so much struggle with relationships. On the flip side, when Apollos don't turn transactional, like try to quote unquote buy relationships, but they instead try to find a match, they oftentimes get attracted to other Artemises or Athenas, right? Young professional women, particularly Athenas, I think. Young professional women who are like them, attractive, goal-oriented, set on, getting bigger things done. And then they'll have that kind of sort of stereotypical young professional relationship. There's also an archetype that comes, or like a theme that runs through this with young Apollos who are gay, where there's a story about Apollo who had a relationship with Hyacinth, and the two of them were inseparable. They just did everything together. They were sort of mirror versions of each other. And then, unfortunately, Apollo's competitive nature ended up leading to Hyacinth's death, and that was crushing for Apollo. But when Apollos are gay, then they usually have that kind of Apollo-Hyacinth relationship, where they are almost mirrors of each other, and they do everything together. And in those situations, Apollo also had tragedy by being too competitive in the relationship. So Apollos struggle with relationships. Like that's sort of Apollo's lot in life, is that he usually has a lot of success in business or anything he wants to accomplish that's goal-oriented. But his biggest challenges are usually in romantic relationships and even in friendships. Like I'm thinking of, I suspect my brother might have quite a bit of Apollo in him, and he's straight and in a straight relationship with his wife and has been for many years. But whenever he's had a relationship, like a friendship with another man, I almost see that Apollo-Hyacinth relationship coming out. Like they're kind of BFFs and they do everything together and they're very similar together. And not all of those relationships have always been sustainable, right? Like sometimes it kind of... it ends when my brother is going to the next level and his friend isn't, you know what I mean? And then kind of ends up having to find a new, BFF at the next level, if that makes sense. So I think regardless of whether or not that's like a romantic Apollo-Hyacinth relationship or a platonic Apollo-Hyacinth relationship, I think Apollo just kind of generally, even though he gets along with men quite well, sometimes that competitiveness can still run through as a challenge in their friendships. So Apollo's struggles are usually in the personal realm, not in the business realm. Yeah,
and I think let's put a pin in that competitive nature, because I think when we talk about growth strategies for Apollo, we're going to revisit this idea of this hyper-competitive framework they're coming from. This energy shows up in men in this over-competitive spirit that I think we should put a pin in when we talk about growth.
Okay. Well, and I think, piggybacking off of that idea of the personal challenges, I think that even when they are in a relationship, Apollos can feel quite lonely. And so I think the challenges that they experience is usually because they are so heady, because everything in moderation, because they are so good at being sort of above it all, then it's hard to get to those roots, those emotional, or even like we talked about Poseidon in the last episode being like very much emotionally, giving himself a lot of emotional permission. And then Hades being the god of the underworld being the place that occupies the unconscious, whether it's in the individual or the collective unconscious. These are realms that Apollo doesn't really visit very much. And so because of that, because Apollo is very much associated with Zeus's more sky god concept, then sometimes he can struggle with depth. Not necessarily intelligence, but being willing to go to the quote unquote underworld or being willing to go into the deep sea of emotion.
Which would also translate to being very extrinsically motivated. Because when you get in touch with your deepest core emotions and desires, you're more intrinsically motivated. So we see a lot of Apollo men showing up in the world, very much looking to the outer metrics of what success looks like, looking at Wall Street, looking at magazine covers, looking at the right cars or watches to wear, looking at the markers of how they dress, rather than thinking in terms of what is it that I actually want at the deepest core level of who I am. So that tends to make Apollos much more extrinsically motivated than intrinsically motivated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and that generally extrinsic, not just motivation, but also seeing those markers can make Apollo sometimes mean, like they have a cruel streak, just like Artemis has a cruel streak. I mean, she, like, number one thing for Artemis is to get in touch with a more generous, more some more sensitive place, because Artemis was just like Apollo. The two of them went and killed all of Niobe's children just because she was bragging, right? And I think there's even a story of Apollo like flaying somebody alive. Like, there's all sorts of cruel, venomous things that Apollo can bring. And in part, it's because he's not really letting himself get emotionally attached to outcomes that aren't beneficial to him. He's like kind of seeing things in terms of almost that idealistic part. It's like, where does idealism and where does external metrics meet? And I think that part of it is in the concept of law and rule, right? Like, there's an idealistic perfection that he's trying to go for. And it's probably a part of his idealized self. Like, he's above it all. He's like perfect, right? And that Yo-Yo Ma, going back to that concept of the musician and the artist, of there's like a perfect perfectionistic streak, an idealized, I can nail this, I can get it just right. That's more the idealism as opposed to like a romantic idealism. It's more of like, it can be just like all things can be perfectly elegant. And so when there's that idealistic streak that comes through with Apollo, then when things go off the rails or don't go exactly as he wanted them to or as he imagined that it should be, then sometimes he can be quite cruel in going, nope, we have to get this back on pace. We have to get it back on track. So these could be like, I mean, if you look at it in a business context, it could be layoffs, right? I mean, layoffs have to happen in certain businesses. But when it's just like, we'll just get rid of all these people so that we can reward somebody at the top because I understand their value, right? I understand this other executive's value and I want to keep them because that's within my vision, right? I can get that. But remembering again that these are all kind of built on a symbiotic relationship with talents of people who may not be orchestrators, but more like individualized talents, but just getting rid of them and seeing them as replaceable. That would be sort of Apollo's modern day sort of cruel streak. And there are times when you have to reorganize companies and you have to let people go. That's something that just has to happen in the modern world. And also, you don't have to be cavalier about it. It can actually be painful, and it should be painful when you let people off. If you let them go, you should be feeling the pierce of that. And if you're not, then you're probably playing fast and loose.
I think a good example of Apollo in popular media is again from the show we talked about on the last episode, Succession on HBO, where there's this Zeus-like father in his 80s with the character of Logan Roy and his second-born son, Kendall Roy, who is very Apollo-like. In all things in the entire show, you can watch him looking for his father's approval. He wants his dad's approval so badly, and he's willing to do whatever it takes. But when in the first episode, I think we see this, when he's dealing with somebody, he wants to buy their company, and the guy's giving him a little hassle over the price or something like this. He is vicious to this other man. He is vicious. His words, his energy, his attitude toward him, just crass and vicious and almost punishing toward this guy in business, this deal he wants to do. The guy he's trying to buy the company from, right? And he buys the company and he continues to berate him and be so toxic and hostile toward him. And then you see his energy change when he's in the presence of his father. He's very supplicating, very, very much looking for approval. He wants dad to approve of him as much as he can. And you can see this back and forth between how punishing he is and how much he's seeking his dad approval. I think his character is excellent to see the Apollo archetype show up. And yet he also has a steady, sober-minded view forward. He's goal-oriented, and he is very rational. In fact, out of all of the children that, or out of the sons, I should say, that Logan Roy has, Kendall is very Apollo and very much the one that has his hand on what will create success in the company, his family's company. And he has a lot of good ideas, but he's definitely that Apollo energy. So if you watch this show, you can see a very Zeus-Apollo relationship in popular media, and I think it's a good example of that. I would say a bad example in popular media where it goes off the rails, that punishing nature, is the son, Ramsay Snow, in the show Game of Thrones, where he literally fillets someone alive, right? He's cutting off their skin. They're called the filleted men. And he is trying, again, to seek his father's approval through being incredibly hostile or incredibly aggressive toward his enemies or people that he has deemed his enemies. And you can see he's hoping that will get his dad's approval by being just vicious and being merciless in how he shows up. And that's a really bad example of how, or a good example of how bad Apollo can show up in a very hostile way. So I think those are two examples of Apollo you can see in popular media if you're questioning how this might look. One is more of maybe an older style look into it, the Game of Thrones style of how it could look in a vicious way, medieval type way. And the other is more of a modern business take on the Apollo energy.
What I like about Kendall as an Apollo is that as the show goes on, you can see that his Apollo nature is not getting him where he wants to go. And he's struggling in the business and he's struggling in his relationship. And you start to see, I don't know where the show's going to go because it's still in its first season. And who knows how much character generation or character development they're going to do within the show, because sometimes shows start to head that direction and then they go off the rails. But I'm already seeing development in him. I'm already seeing sort of a more sort of like he's now contending with his own feelings, and it's causing him to go to substance abuse. But you can see that he knows that there's something in the underworld for him, and that he's going to have to go there. And I would love to see how that eventually plays out, because Apollos can struggle, right? When things are like they've done everything right, they did everything they were supposed to do, and it still didn't work out for them. And so then in a situation like that, an Apollo has to have a come to Jesus moment, right? And they've got to figure out what's going on for them. And I think, Bolin talks about the growth for an Apollo is a couple different things. The first one is making room for Dionysus. Now we'll talk about Dionysus in a future episode, but what's interesting about his oracles at Delphi is that for 3 winter months, Apollo would leave and go hang out with the Hyperboreans, and the place at Delphi, his oracles at Delphi, would then make room for Dionysus. And Dionysus is the god of wine and the god of basically
indulgences.
Yeah, ecstasy and wine and sort of a place of, indulgences, but not exactly the way you're thinking about it, right? Because Dionysus it can also go a more stoic route, interestingly enough. And when we talk about his archetype, we'll get to that place. But it's a place of like a sensual place, like a place of not having to have all your ducks in a row. It's a place of chaos and a place of sensuality. And having a place of sensuality allows an Apollo to get more in touch with an earthy place, right? Not so distant, more grounded, more brought to earth, more about the good things of life, not just like the markers of success, but being present, being in their life, not just orchestrating it, not just hoping everything will fall exactly how the ideal looks, but sort of a messy place that allows them to be present and messy and enjoy what life has to offer and the fruits of their success, not just in striving, but actually in being there. And the more an Apollo can be in their life, the more present they get, the more connected they are to other people's experience as well. And they see the results of their behavior and they have a sense of sympathy. And I think that sort of making room for a Dionysus is a path of growth for Apollos.
But just like everything Apollo's good at, when an Apollo man looks at something and sees a goal or objective, they tend to find the tools or resources or the pathway to that objective. So an Apollo man might say, yes, I need more sensuality or more connection or more down-to-earthness or more presence in my life. And here's, you go back to the character in the show Succession, Kendall, where he's dealing with some substance abuse issues. It's because he's looking to set a goal and achieve it through tool sets and through a tactic or some type of a metric, which is, using substance basically to synthesize that true presence or that true sensuality. So it's a synthetic presence, a synthetic sensuality, using substance as the tool. So what Apollo needs to do in order to actually access more of the Dionysus side is to let go of the tools, let go of the to-do list, let go of the mechanisms and all the the set a goal and achieve it mentality. It's more about being than it is about doing. And that's where I think this is a nuance or distinction here. Sometimes Apollo can get caught up in things like substance abuse or overindulgences because he's not thinking in terms of just letting go. He's thinking of terms of trying to still do it through means he knows and understands because that's how he's wired. So it's really about shifting the mindset from trying to do something to now being something.
Yeah, no, that's a really great observation. I think Boleyn talks about this idea of if Apollo is a musician, allowing room for Dionysus means not having to be so precise yo-yo ma, right? And more of the chaotic, going towards just music as an experience, as opposed to as hitting a goalpost. Like let go of when you pick up the lyre, right? Because Apollo and we'll talk about Hermes and Apollo's relationship with the lyre in a moment. But when you pick up the lyre, let go of the bow and arrow. Like, don't make it so targeted. Make it about the experience. And she also mentions the importance of sensuality in sex for an Apollo. If Apollo has sort of this disconnected experience, then or emotional experience, he's going to bring that over into his lovemaking as well. So Apollo making room for Dionysus in a sort of a present orgasmic experience and getting really into the sensuality and the chaos of lovemaking can be a path of growth actually for Apollos, just letting themselves go and not having to be so controlled. And then I think she also mentions a couple other things of growth for Apollo. And one of them is really interesting because Apollo had these precepts, right? You mentioned the know thyself and all things in moderation. But he also had a precept that was called keep the woman under rule, right? That was one of Apollo's precepts. And Boleyn suggests that Apollo let go of that precept by allowing the inner anima to come out. So getting in touch with his feminine side. An Apollo man can let go of this whole keeping his own, it doesn't just have to look like keeping women in the outside world under rule. It's actually more him keeping his own emotional side, or I don't know if it's exactly his own emotional side, but the naturally more feminine element, like whatever his anima is. It could be an emotional, right? Emotional Persephone, or sort of an emotional Demeter or Hera or Aphrodite, or it could be a more heady Athena or a heady, Artemis. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an emotional side, but it's a feminine side. And that feminine side will bring along certain feminine qualities, which might help season and temper the Apollo. So sort of letting go of that precept and allowing the inner feminine to come up can be a path of growth for Apollo as well.
She also mentions this idea of humility. And I think because Apollo is so good at so many things and probably just has so much success in his life, it's almost like I can do anything I want and I've got so many skills, I'm untouchable. And I would actually say it's probably less about humility as it is about modesty, really understanding what you are good at. If you're an Apollo man listening, or if you have this energy showing up in your life, what you are good at, being accurate about what you're good at and accurate about what you aren't good at. I think that's really how we here define modesty. And that's probably very important for an Apollo man to really have a sense of, I think a lot of Apollo men, because they've had so much success, can almost show up with some hubris. Hey, we're going to do this project. Here's the goal. It's almost expected that it'll work out. And there's some hubris, and having some modesty can actually help get the true successes in life rather than having that, remember that idealistic streak Apollo has. There's idealism and hubris with some modesty and humility, particularly modesty, that can really help dial in true success, and so there's not disappointment or frustration in your life.
Yeah, and not focusing so much on having to get all the credit that you think is due, right? Like I think Apollo men, along with that hubris, then they need to have a lot of credit in order to have justified that initial hubris. And so Apollo men have a tendency to always be looking for credit and kind of letting go of some of that, not needing to be like, full credit for everything you've done. Just kind of let it go and be like, okay, well, I did some stuff and that's cool. And I don't always have to be referencing back to how good I did. And the final element that Bolin recommends for growth is making love your motivator, right? Love, knowing when to follow your heart, not just always being heady. Now, if you are an Apollo archetyped man, then you probably are going to have an element of you that is more heady. And that's most likely a lot of your advantages and a lot of your character traits that are positive come from that. So it's not like, like replacing that with a bunch of emotional feeler criteria and all of a sudden you'll be balanced. I don't think that's really what she's saying. I think it's more like to remember that love is an incredibly important component. And I think of this almost like in the 4 Greek definitions of love, one of them was agape, and agape was principled love. And that's not necessarily like an overtly emotional experience. It's a principled love that comes from sort of a concept of love for humanity. It's more about understanding the sustainable advantages to having a loving frame and wanting to do things that are in other people's best interest as well as your own. And so it doesn't have to necessarily be like rushed to an emotional place, but it's more like understand that underlying everything is in the universe is sort of this glue that is love. And so you can still make it sort of, it doesn't have to be a touchy-feely form of love. It can be a more conceptual, abstract form of love. But remember that it is ultimately what all of us want. From the time we were babies, that's what we're all looking for. We were all looking for love. And sometimes we didn't get as much of it or in the way that we wanted to get it. And so we lost track of that. And we started to turn to strategy and started to turn to things that would give us something that would fill in the bucket that love was originally intended to fill. And so going back to the etymology that we're all still just kind of looking for love, right? That approval seeking, that, that need for credit, the reach out for other people's relationships and then feeling maybe disappointed that it didn't work out. Like all of these come back to a need to develop a stronger relationship with the concept of love. So for Apollos, that really is the path of growth for them, is to get a more direct one-to-one relationship with love.
So let's shift over to Zeus's other favorite son, also very cerebral and heady. Let's talk about Hermes. Hermes is the messenger god. He's the guide of souls. He's a good communicator, he's very good with words. He's also a trickster god and the traveler god. So he's always on the move, has a tendency to have a trickster nature to him, very good communicator. And you often see the image of the winged shoes, right? This is also in the Roman god pantheon, Mercury, but it's the same god really. Hermes, the winged shoes of being the messenger that travels between places. And Hermes is also known for being able to travel between Mount Olympus and the underworld freely, between the two of those. And that's really one of the things he's known for. He has a lot of quickness in his motion and thinking. He's quick-witted. He can turn on a dime. He's very responsive and very intelligent in his responses. Again, good communicator, very persuasive, can mesmerize people with his words and the way he speaks. He crosses boundaries, and he's very friendly. He's one of the friendliest of the gods. Everybody seems to like Hermes. He's the life of the party. He's the class clown. He's the one that all the others seem to like, as he's got just a really good disposition toward other people, toward other gods in the pantheon. Everybody seems to like Hermes. He's a good guy. Hermes' genealogy, or his origin story, he's the son of Zeus and Maya. He had a special relationship with his brother Apollo. He was a very charming baby, and really the first day of Hermes' existence speaks to how Hermes is. He was born in the morning. By noon, he invented the lyre. By evening, he had gone out and he had stolen his brother's cows, his brother Apollo's cows in the evening. And then by night, he was back in his cradle, pretending to be an innocent little baby, just playing and pretending to be innocent. And so this almost is a good starting point to see Hermes in just how tricky he is, just how precocious he is, just how freeform, how eager, almost this image of the baby climbing over the crib, when he's very young and entering the world way before you'd assume he'd be ready. He's out there and doing things. He's already tricking on day one. He's inventing something on day one. He's playing music on day one. And then he's going back and pretending like, oh, what? Nothing happened here. Nothing to see here. I'm just doing my thing. So we can see his character already developing. Some of his ethos, some of the character traits that Hermes brings out. He was very much into alchemy. So he guided others to find spiritual gold. He was an alchemist. He would transfer things from one realm to another. He would travel between realms and turn things, into spiritual gold, basically. He carried a staff with 2 snakes on it, representing death and rebirth, and very much this yin-yang symbology between light and darkness, or the overworld and the underworld. Because of his trickster nature, you could almost see him as a con man, or in some ways maybe that stereotypical used car salesman type of person, right? He's very much like persuasive and no, we'll get this. We'll handle this for you. And just buy this car, like this kind of energy. He could probably talk anyone into anything. And this came from him feeling like he was the underdog. His brother Apollo was the one that was organized and thoughtful and set goals and accomplished them. And Hermes always felt like he had to compete with that. And he knew he couldn't directly compete with Apollo on Apollo's turf or Apollo's terms or the way Apollo competed. So he had to find ways to trick the system, to go around the system, to be more freeform. And he did that through exploration and openness. He was a very open god archetype. And this is how he was able to get ahead, by being that very quick pivoting, very energetic, very precocious god energy that would show up and almost had this underdog competitive nature with his brother Apollo.
When I see Hermes, like especially maybe as illustrated by his sons, it looks like Hermes has the capacity to go either way, in either the worst or the best. His sons were, a couple of his sons were like considered arch thieves and perjurers, and Pan was one of his children, and he was considered, ill-tempered and lustful. And then on the other side, there was his son Eurotas, who took on Hermes' best aspects, and he was kind, and he was faithful, uncomplicated. He was a shepherd, and he was a caretaker. And then he also had Hermaphroditus with his love affair with Aphrodite. And this was sort of the part of him that is very either removes himself from like kind of almost asexual, or all the way over to being like sort of bisexual. And so like it was, his sons show that he could kind of go any direction. A Hermes character can go any direction. They can either be like really, really bad, that con man, thief, perjurer, deceitful, only out for themselves. And what's crazy is that in that story with Apollo, where he steals his cows, Apollo doesn't get too mad at him. I mean, goes to Zeus and he's like, hey, make sure that Hermes gives me back my cows. And Zeus then intervenes, and then they have a sort of a compromise where Apollo gets Hermes' lyre that he had just invented, and Hermes gets some of his cows. But it's like nobody really punished Hermes that much, right? When he did all this deceitful stuff, nobody really gave him enough punishment to dissuade him from this kind of behavior. So if a Hermes is that good, right, if they are that charming and they can get away with all this stuff, then they end up going to the worst elements of it, which is no matter how bad they get, they're still somehow able to sort of get away with it. I think of the character in Catch Me If You Can. Do you remember like Leonardo DiCaprio's character? Yeah. That's very much a Hermes that has been able to get away with stuff his whole life. And actually, now that I think about it, the other character was probably very much an Apollo, right? Tom Hanks' character was probably an Apollo. And Hermes had this weird, like friendly looking up to his big brother relationship with Tom Hanks' character. And Tom Hanks' character as an Apollo had like sort of like almost he got a soft spot for the Leonardo DiCaprio's Hermes character. And so you kind of see that this relationship is it's not fully antagonistic. It's sort of fond of each other. And if a Hermes is able to get away with a bunch of stuff, they can go down that road. And then on the other side, they can turn into a really amazing person. Like Hermes had, as mentioned, access to both Mount Olympus and the underworld freely. And he was usually the one who went and, when somebody was in the underworld that shouldn't have been there, he was the one that went and got Persephone for Zeus. He was a messenger and a traveler. His name actually comes from those cairns, right? Like the rock formations that let travelers know that they're on the right path. And as a messenger god, he was also a great teacher. And that was what he was considered, was sort of a guide, right? Like with the cairns and the messenger and and having access to all these different planes. He was the one that saw so much and then was able to bring back wisdom and guidance for others. So a Hermes character can either go down the thief con man path, or they can go down the great teacher path, which is as a Hermes archetyped, man, or if Hermes is your animus, I have put myself in situations where I have seen a lot. I've been constantly traveling. I've seen the worst of humanity. I've seen the best of humanity. I have learned all these things through my sort of heady, sort of conceptualized pattern recognizing all this stuff, right? Regardless of whether or not they're an intuitive, they're still going to see a lot and really understand sort of something about the world that other people who don't really allow themselves to have all those experiences, they're going to see a lot more. And if they bring out that positive, that sort of Eurotus caretaking nature part, then they're going to couple all of these elements with something that wants to serve and to give back. And so they become these teachers and guides for other people, so they can go, hey, learn from my mistakes, learn from my experiences, and do it in an easier way.
As boys, Hermes men tend to be very precocious. They learn quickly, they're active, creative, and sometimes deceptive or cunning, exploring everything around them, right? This is a very free form, open source boyhood that they have, of just constantly looking for the next thing that they can explore and understand. They're probably playing with matches at home, lighting, using magnifying glasses to burn bugs in the back. They're very much just getting their fingers and hands into everything around the house as young boys. And because of this nature they develop as they start to get older, they're very much on the move. The jet setter lifestyle lends itself much to a Hermes man who might move from job to job to job, relationship to relationship to relationship. There's this kind of classical Hermes viewpoint of that young man that sweeps into town and, seduces the farmer's daughter, or the local, banker's daughter or something, kind of coming into town quickly, having a really fast burning romance for a short time, and then bouncing, and then going to the next town and doing that all over again. The traveling salesman style, that snake oil salesman kind. And a snake oil salesman sounds like a bad term, but it's this traveling salesman that can go and basically communicate with people from different towns, having seen the world, understanding the mindset of people from place to place, and really getting more and more information and being able to weave a great narrative. And this can actually be a really good benefit too. If you're somebody that's into sales or you travel a lot for your work, this might be something that shows up for you as a Hermes man. However, being so persuasive and can often, when, caught being cunning or tricky, flashes that big smile, that really big, oh, I didn't really mean it, I was just kidding, I was just joking kind of smile. Really what happens is shortcuts can be taken. I think the Hermes man can look for the easy way to cut and run when things aren't going exactly how they want to go. Instead of sticking it out, it's like, well, I'll just bounce. I'll go to the next town over and just restart this whole process. So shortcuts, I think, can often spring up for the Hermes man as we talk about this being embodied in an actual man. Work will most likely be innovative, guiding, or communicative. So their work is often going to be in the communication, maybe a coach, maybe a teacher, someone that helps other people, which is often incredible. Women tend to be attracted to Hermes men because of that good boy, bad boy image, that kind of get in trouble, but flash that big smile when you get in trouble and be like, I didn't really mean it, shrug the shoulders. That could be intoxicating for women around this Hermes man. But at the end of the day, as much sociability as the Hermes man has, as much, communication and travel he does, at the end of the day, often he's a loner. You probably see this in a lot of stand-up comics that are traveling the country, traveling the world. They're jet setting, they're good communicators, they're making people laugh, they're connecting with audiences, but then after the performance, they go back to a hotel room by themselves and sit there by themselves until they drive or fly to the next city to do it all over again. So I think that archetype can spring up. As a father, Hermes men can often be very permissive. They're used to kind of flashing that big smile and getting away with a lot and being very exploratory. So they want their children to have some of that same freedom. So they don't tend to put a lot of rules or structure on their children, which can cause trouble with their mates, their co-parent, and then the children themselves can grow up with a lot of challenges based on not having structure in their childhood. So some of the more negative characteristics could be impulsive, trickster. There's almost a boy man quality, and also a lack of commitment or intimacy can spring up. However, again, let's look at the positive traits. That Hermes man that's a good communicator, if they can bring some stability into their life, and we'll talk about some growth strategies here in a minute, I think they can be excellent teachers, excellent coaches, excellent communicators, guides between different worlds, helping bridge gaps between people, helping people form understanding between each other. I think this can be something that the Hermes man can bring to the world, really that understanding of one way of thinking and another way of thinking, and helping people reconcile those two. I think this is a Hermes man's, one of their greatest strengths when they show up in this way.
Yeah, and that whole concept of Hermes being able to, there's a lot of positives that come from Hermes. When Hermes was, the idea of him being able to freely go into the underworld is, and he oftentimes, when he was going to the underworld, he wasn't just visiting, he was usually rescuing. He went and rescued Persephone. He went and rescued Dionysus. There was a story of him rescuing Ares from a jar. And Hermes as a rescuer is kind of an interesting thing because he's not really a hero. This is not like a heroic rescuing. It's more kind of like a, oh, hey, yeah, you're kind of in a bind, aren't you? Well, do you want some help? Okay, cool. Come with me and I'll help you out. It's more of like a free, not like a heroic, I have to save rescuer mentality. It's more like a, hey, do you want me to help you out there? Well, like come with me and I'll take you to where you need to go.
I think Han Solo is in Star Wars is this. Hey, get on the ship. Let's fly out. Like, quick, I got a ship. Let's go. He's not like slaying the dragon. He's trying to get out of there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not the reluctant hero. It's more just kind of like I got a ship. You want to come with? And I think what's interesting about that that sort of attitude is Boleyn talks about this being a rescuer of the child, Persephone as a child, and Dionysus as a child. And she mentions that in her own practice as a psychotherapist, she's noticed a Hermes archetype come out as the rescuer of the depressed child within the individual themselves. So they can either be the rescuer of a depressed child outward. I think of the movie Life is Beautiful, right? And the Hermes character, that's all about a father trying to help his son get through the Nazi concentration camp experience by being playful the entire time and turning it into a game. And in that situation, he truly was rescuing his child psychologically from the underworld of these concentration camps. And so a Hermes can, do maybe a magic trick to help a little kid who's sad feel better. But they can also, the Hermes archetype spirit can help a kid who's going through maybe abuse or something truly bad. She mentions that she was talking to one of her clients, and he said that he was a Hermes archetype, and he said that when he was in an abusive situation, he would tell himself that these are not my parents, I'm being tested. So it's like a way of almost turning it into a game or conceptualizing it, staying in the realm of thought to be able to gamify a situation to get through something that would otherwise turn like maybe trap somebody in an underworld experience, trap them in the darkness or trap them in that sea of emotion of Poseidon's realm. And so Hermes has a way of creating sort of a lightness to a situation that can help people survive and be survivors, not only of other people, but also within the individual themselves. So that's a really positive trait that Hermes comes with, is that ability to kind of be above it all. Now, it can, again, make them turn everything into a game, which, what crosses us supports us. So the way that it supports us is being able to get through tough times. But when a situation isn't tough and it's good and might require some of those roots, Hermes has trouble staying. And he might want to kind of dance away from that too. But in a situation that's not good, A Hermes person will not keep themselves in a bad situation just because. They'll see what can be changed and do what they can to get themselves and others out of bad situations.
Again, popular media, I keep going back to the show Succession because it's such a good example of this. You can see in Succession the father, Logan Roy, as the Zeus. You see his second-born son, Kendall Roy, as the Apollo, and then his next, I think his third-born son, Roman Roy, who is very Hermes. And in fact, in the show, there's a period of time where he tricks his older brother Apollo, so you get to see that play out. But there's also this moment where his older brother, the Apollo character of Kendall, can't seem to make this deal happen, and he sends his brother says, "Look, I got this." The Hermes goes in, and with his silver tongue and his smooth talk, telling the person what the other person wanted to hear, closes a deal and basically makes this happen. But then later on embarrasses himself with another deal because he doesn't know all the facts of what's going on. He thinks he can just fall back on his silver tongue again and talk his way through something, and he ends up embarrassing his Apollo brother and himself in this one scenario. And it's a very interesting display of the Apollo and Hermes looking for the Zeus father approval in the show. And I think it's if you want to see an example of this play out, I think that show is excellent for that relationship dynamic between these two brothers looking to Zeus for approval. I think it's a really good example of that.
Well, and doesn't the Apollo son end up like taking drugs with a bunch of other people, and it's the Hermes brother that comes and gets him?
I think so.
Yeah.
He basically rescues him from the underworld.
Yeah.
Like literally.
I don't know if you, the listener, would enjoy the show Succession, but if you're going to look at it through the lens of these archetypes, it's almost perfect. The father is a Zeus. The stepmother is a total Hera. The oldest son is a Hephaestus. The next son is an Apollo. The third son, Roman, is a Hermes. And the daughter is a total Athena. And it's just amazing to watch these archetypes. Their archetypes are even more obvious to me than their Myers-Briggs types.
Well, at the end of the show, every week, there's a little graphic that flashes the production company, and it says Project Zeus Incorporated or something on that. So it's really interesting that I think maybe even the filmmakers, the creators themselves are aware of these archetypes at play, and almost like with intention, because they're almost pure expressions of each archetype.
Yeah, it is a little serendipitous. So going back to Hermes, the challenge that Hermes has is kind of similar to Apollo too, in this idea of like the positive elements, which is association with the sky god, so a more thinker place, ends up creating that favored position. And so on some levels there's struggle, but there's a different kind of struggle. It's more it's a favored son struggle, not a rejected son struggle. It's the element where the demons all come from within. And with Hermes, one of the big challenges a Hermes man has is just like Apollo in forming those relationships, those close relationships. Because Hermes is used to being charismatic, just like Apollo is used to being sort of the golden boy. Hermes is used to being charismatic. I see Apollo as almost like, not that every person who has an Apollo archetype is an EJ, but I almost kind of see them like EJs in the Myers-Briggs system. And I see Hermes as EPs in the Myers-Briggs system. Not that you can't be an Apollo or Hermes if you're a different personality type, but that's kind of sort of the correlation I see in my mind. And so the Apollos are the golden boys, but the Hermes are like sort of the charming, charismatic boys or men. And so there's a lot of benefit that comes from that, but there's also a loneliness that can infest a Hermes because they're always on the go. That's so hard for them to stay rooted. They've seen so much, right? And they're used to sort of dancing their way through things. So a Hermes, just like an Apollo, might have a streak of loneliness that they have to deal with, a lack of intimacy. When it comes to one of the benefits is that because they see so much when it comes to things like sexuality, they're very open. Like a Hermes man might just be sort of naturally bisexual, just like his son Hermaphrodite was, or could have been. And so there's this idea that usually Hermes men are not very judgmental of others. Like they're live and let live. They're very accepting of their own, sexuality, whatever that is. They don't feel like they have to sort of plug themselves into a social norm necessarily. And they're very open with other people's sexuality. They don't have a lot of judgment around that. But then a challenge can be that because they are so non-judgmental and so open, there's this idea of sort of dancing through everything and not really rooting themselves. And so they might be very in touch with their own sexual permission, but they might not be in touch with the sort of the person they want, right? There's there's not a specificity around their own personal, like the specific desire they want to sort of settle down with. Not to say that every person has to necessarily settle down, but intimacy is built over time. And so there might be a challenge for a Hermes man to build intimacy. They might build a lot of sort of more shallow relationships because they have a lot of variety in their desire. And also there was one woman who Hermes really is associated with, and that is Aphrodite. It's the only like relationship that the Greek mythos goes into.
What's interesting about Aphrodite is she was extremely challenging for Hermes because Hermes is so, open-framed and such a great persuader and so charismatic and so energetically attractive that a lot of women would just fall for him. And that energy being challenged can be intoxicating. Having Aphrodite challenge him and push back at him and give him something to have to work hard for and not just, easily fall for him and be persuaded by him. I think for a Hermes man with that energy, that's intoxicating. That really speaks to his heart to feel like, wow, I've got a woman that pushes back against me and makes me have to become a better man to be with her, which I think can really help him be in a growth state. Some of the other things for growth too, thinking in terms of, his looking to approval from Zeus, I think Hermes tends to want to be freeform and free, but really tethering to Zeus is something that is good for Hermes to grow. Now, when we say tethered to Zeus, we don't always mean look for a father figure for approval, but I think what it is it's having a higher authority that you're beholden to. So that could be an authority of some type of a religious structure or something of, a God figure that you're allegiant to, that you have a sense of, basically beholden to. Or it could be an internal code of ethics, something that you have a code of ethics. You say, the inner Zeus in you says, I will not stand for this, I will stand for this. And not just in other people, but doing that for yourself, having an inner code of ethics about what's appropriate for you as a Hermes man, showing up in that way. That's important to cultivate those things because that's going to give you a sense of, almost if Apollo is extrinsically motivated, Hermes is probably just as intrinsically motivated on the other side. He needs a little more extrinsic connection and motivation and some authority from outside himself in some ways.
Yeah. Well, and to piggyback off of that idea of finding the Aphrodite, that could also be an inner Aphrodite. It could be Hermes' anima. And so it's not just about finding somebody who's a challenge that really kind of keeps you intoxicated in the relationship, but it could also be getting in touch with your own personal sensual side. Not just the fun of life, but actually more of a present sensual piece, kind of like Apollo. Really being present and in the moment, being sensual, remembering the here and now, not just always going for what's interesting and next. And so like Apollo was so goal-oriented, but Hermes is very sort of movement-oriented. Like what's coming next? What's the next interesting thing? And so having an Aphrodite sensual present will be really good for Hermes. And one of the challenges we haven't talked about the parental role of all of these different archetypes as much, except for Demeter, because it's so much a part of her identity. But with Hermes, one of the challenges that they can have as a parent is that they can be very distant, right? They can always be on the go and not very in touch with their children. And one of the challenges that Aphrodite had, remember, was that she's very in tune with her children, and then all of a sudden she's not, right? And so that can kind of create in her children sort of almost like an addictive quality that they want all that full blast to be turned in. So when a Hermes man is finding his anima, the Aphrodite piece is really important for like getting into that present here and now. But he also might want to tap into a sort of Demeter energy as well. So he's more present with his children. So they don't feel like he's always missing from their lives. He's always on the run. So kind of making space for that inner anima, whatever that is for the Hermes man, can be very powerful for him to get rooted, to stay with commitments, to stay with the things that he's already said yes to at one point in his life that he might all of a sudden feel a no around, like a child or something to that effect, but to stay loyal and committed. and focused. And there are other archetypes that also help with that, like an Aries man and some others. So that loyalty piece is very important for Hermes as well. And one final element in the development of Hermes can be seen in his story with Dionysus. Dionysus is called the divine child, and we'll talk a little bit about that more in his episode. But the going and saving Dionysus, Hermes like going into the underworld and helping Persephone sort of being reborn, and then helping Dionysus in this divine child piece can give Hermes an almost spiritual element. So teaching or helping people get in touch with a more spiritual element is also a path of growth for Hermes, because he's already a messenger god. So turning his attention outward, like you mentioned, the extrinsic motivation not being stuff, but the extrinsic motivation being how he can touch other people's lives and help them get in touch with a bigger message for themselves.
So when we talk about these two sun gods, Apollo and Hermes, you can see them as favored sons. You can see them as both successful, the energies that show up in men's lives as successful energies, the archetypes that help achievement, success, travel, articulation, communication. Like there's all this good stuff that comes from it. There's a couple things we have to watch out for if you're one of these archetypes. And you can see why they're considered the favorite sons. Zeus seemed to really like the fact they were attuned to success. And things seem to come easy for both of these sun gods. They seem to have a good time of it and have a lot of success in their lives. And it seems like when you have this energy in your life, one of these two energies in your life showing up, challenge might be something very challenging for you. When troubles come, when challenges come, when things don't go exactly as you expect them to, I think both of these archetypes can be tempted to say, I'm frustrated. This isn't working out how it should work out. And instead of seeing it as maybe just a challenge that's getting in your way, challenges, I think, one of the overarching principles of growth for both Apollo and Hermes energies is to look at challenge as an opportunity to really get in touch and recalibrate yourself going forward. So Apollo can look at the challenges and get more in touch with the deeper motivations and the sensual nature, more of the emotional side of himself. Hermes can use challenge to create more stability, to create more longevity, more logic, more rootedness. And so these challenges, I think, that show up for you in your life as a man or someone that has this energy coursing through you, this is a gift. Don't see it as something that's hijacking the thing you've always had success around or things that may have come easy for you. See it as such a great opportunity to grow. I think that's really the key for both of these types.
Yeah, when we have really good initial conditions, and that doesn't always mean that everything goes easy for us, sometimes we can feel sort of entitled, right? Like we go, oh, well, but things have always come easy for me. They should continue to come easy for me. And there's really no should statements in life that really hold up. In fact, most of the time, our character is forged in those challenges. So as you mentioned, Joel, the important thing for the favored sun gods is to not feel entitled to things coming to them easily. They should see all of the challenges and struggle as what is forging their character to really be better people and to be able to see outside of their experience, to be able to sympathize with other people who don't necessarily have a quote unquote favored son status, who have a really maybe very bad initial conditions, and connecting with them and seeing how they can serve, not just be served.
So on the next episode, we're going to talk about the rejected sons of Ares and Hephaestus. But if you've been listening up till now, it's your turn to make your voice heard. We want to hear your story. Do you identify with one of these sun god energies? Do you identify with Apollo, or do you identify with Hermes? Or if you have more of a feminine archetype, is this your animus, or one of these two your animus? We want to hear your story over at personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment or ask a question or share your experience with these archetypes directly under the podcast in the comments. Let's get a conversation going around this topic. I think it's a really powerful archetypical conversation. I think it's lending us here at Personality Hacker, myself and Antonia and our team, some very interesting behind the scenes conversations about the different energies and archetypes at play in ourselves and the people we meet and engage with in the world. It's really an exciting exciting new body of understanding to add on to the Myers-Briggs and Enneagram world. It's just another way to see ourselves and look at pathways of personal growth. So you can do that over at personalityhacker.com. You can also join our community of like minds at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK.
And if you enjoyed this program, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you'd like to leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that is extremely helpful to us. Also, if you are interested in helping support us and your own personal development, you can head over to personalityhacker.com and look at our catalog of programs. Right now, if you are really sort of interested in taking your journey to the next level, my recommendation is to check out the Intuitive Awakening program, which talks a lot about balancing ourselves out and becoming the best versions of ourselves, particularly if you are an intuitive in the Myers-Briggs system. So go check out Intuitive Awakening or any of our other products in our catalog to see if one is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next episode of the Personality Hacker Podcast. We'll see you then.